I don't know if it's on. Um, I'm sorry. Roger and I always said that what makes us cry is not sadness, but goodness. And when I first saw this movie, I was afraid it was going to be an expose of the dark side of Mr. Rogers or something. And I have loved Fred Rogers for so many years and felt his sincerity and authenticity and saw what it meant to so many kids. When I saw this movie in a theater, it was the men in the audience who were crying. They were crying. And I was asking someone, why do you think that is? And they said, it's so much more difficult for a man to be able to tell someone that he needs them to tell them that they love him or that they're accepted or they're just fine just the way they are, that they have value just the way they are. And to see someone like Mr. Rogers doing it, I remember when Esquire magazine did this article, because at first people used to make fun of Mr. Rogers. Oh, he wears that sweater, he's this, he's that. And Esquire did this article saying, Mr. Rogers is so cool. He teaches you really how to be a man, how to be a real man. And anyway, I want to just have Morgan Neville come out on the stage so we can give him the Humanitarian Award.
Thank you. I don't even know what to say. I mean, getting this award, coming from you and what it stands for, knowing the last person to get this award was Norman Lear.
Yes, there have only been this is now the third. The first humanitarian award was given to a film called Disturbing the Peace, about peace efforts between Palestinians and Israelis. Norman Lear was the first person. The other one was, and this is the second film to get the award.
Wow. Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you. As I said, this film was like a personal mission for me that kind of summed up everything positive I wanted to put into the world. There's so much negativity put into the world. And when I think about what Fred's message fundamentally was about, what he talked about more than anything was that the world was split between fear and love. And that those are the two great forces that control us. Because fear, if you don't treat it, becomes things like hatred and resentment. And the only thing you can do is try and help people process that fear into understanding. And I felt like if our culture doesn't have a lot of unprocessed fear now, we need more Fred Rogers into this world and to spread that message. It was just the thing I needed to hear, and I just felt this incredible responsibility to not mess it up.
I think you got it right.
Thank you.
If you take a seat in the center,
yes.
We're going to invite two people on stage. Actually, one, they're both editors at RogerEbert.com. Sorry.
It's all good.
I'm sorry, but I invited them because this guy here is one of the kindest, most compassionate guys
No,
around.
this guy is too.
No, I'm telling this is one. And so is Nick.
Yes,
this is Matt Fagerholm and Nick Allen.
he is.
Please join us. And wait, where's Nell Minow? I think where's Nell? Is Nell here?
I
No.
don't know if I've seen her.
We'll see.
Okay. Guys, go ahead. I just have to say one other thing, then I'm really going to let you two take over. Of course, the other reason that makes me cry is I had my own Mr. Rogers, and who was someone who was so kind and so compassionate. Nobody's perfect, we know that. But the depth of Rogers' compassion and goodness was astounding. It was amazing to be able to peer into somebody else's soul and see how much they cared about other people and to see the things that they wanted to change to bring goodness into the world. I thought it was always a cosmic joke that his profession in life was as a critic. Because when it came to being compassionate and kind and loving, there was no artifice, no criticism, no nothing. It was just the most beautiful, unconditional love. So, anyway.
So, on behalf of everybody here, I want to thank you for making this movie and getting
Thank you.
Fred Rogers back into our daily lives, essentially. Me and my friend kind of talk about him like he's a spirit. You know, it's like, oh, Fred would be proud, or, you should do that. Just Fred would want that, too. So I kind of wanted... The one part of the movie that's really hard for me to watch involves Francois, and when it shows kind of nobody's perfect. And it's an example of how even someone we want him to be the perfection of empathy, shows that there's always progress to be made. And I realized I should ask that because I was watching it again today for like the fourth time, and I was like, oh, I really am dreading this moment because it's so hard, but then you follow up with Francois' personal connection to him, and I wanted to know for you kind of how important that was to bring that part in that relationship, but also that kind of imperfection.
It was crucial for many reasons, but I'll just tell you, when I first met Joanne Rogers, Mrs. Rogers, who's an incredible woman, still going strong at 92 years old, and she still texts me all the time with lots of emojis and lots of love. She's amazing. But when I first was pitching her on making this film, I said, I want to make a film about ideas, and you need to trust me to do this and give me complete control. But, you need to understand what my mission is, which is to take him seriously. And she said, I love that idea, but the thing you have to do is make sure not to make him into a saint. And I thought for her to say that was so wise. And I think it wasn't just what I wanted to hear as a documentary filmmaker. I think it was to treat him as a saint was to treat him two-dimensionally, which is how everybody always treated Fred, as this cardboard character. And I think not understanding the struggle he went through sells him short, but it also doesn't ask enough of us as an audience or as people to live up to it if he somehow exists in this saintly plane. He was very human. He struggled with these things, and I felt like that human was the crucial part to get into it. And that Francois moment was one of those moments that he struggled with and didn't always make the right decisions, but I think at the end of the day came a long way from where he had started on those issues.
Adding to that, one of my favorite parts about the movie and your structure of it is that it's about the philosophy of Fred Rogers, but also the show as this text about how we can be empathizing with people and connecting with people. For you, in the editorial process, was there anything that you were not able to include?
Well, I mean, there was so much.
Sure.
So I'll just say, I was born in 1967. So I was like first generation Mr. Rogers fanatic. When I was 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. And then I didn't think about him for 40 years. It's not like he really was somebody who kind of disappeared from my life and came back to it in strange ways over the last maybe 8 years. I'd made a film with Yo-Yo Ma called The Music of Strangers, and Yo-Yo had been on the show a number of times. And one day at lunch, when I was just getting to know Yo-Yo, I happened to say to him, "So, Yo-Yo, how did you figure out how to be famous?" And he said, "Oh, Mr. Rogers taught me." And I kind of laughed like that. And he said, "No, I'm serious," that he realized that I was struggling with fame, and he mentored me over years to show me how I could use that as a positive force for social change and not something that was going to destroy me. And that was like this, planted this seed. I didn't think at that moment I'm going to make a Mr. Rogers documentary, but it got me thinking about him differently. And every time he somehow passed my transom through a Facebook viral video or whatever, I always was looking at it differently, and every time I saw something new in it. So it was just this process of kind of circling it. So to get to your question, he did 913 episodes, I think. There was so much more that doesn't fit in there. But many of them are other examples. I mean, you could talk about, him demonstrating everything from how to deal with death to how to deal with divorce to deal with race. There were many, many other examples that were just as interesting, but became redundant in storytelling. But in terms of how he talked about the environment, "Tree, Tree, Tree" was one of my favorite Mr. Rogers songs. We actually used it as score, at the end. I feel like many of the things in the film are representative of much deeper strains of things that existed throughout the show, too. So, we just had to be reductive in that way.
Do you know if the episode with Coco the gorilla is available anywhere, the whole episode?
I should double check, but many of the episodes are on Amazon Prime streaming right now, at least 100 of them. And I think the Coco episode's there. So if you have young children, and many, many people have told me that they put these shows on for them now, and the kids love them. I mean, there's this kind of idea that kids today don't have the attention span, but a 2-year-old isn't born with a short attention span, And but even many parents have told me they were surprised that their modern media kids can still really connect with Fred. There's also a kid show today called Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, which is a kind of an animated version kind of the show, which is the #1 animated show on PBS. So young kids are actually kind of familiar with this universe in some strange way. So it lives on in that way. But it's great to go back and look at the episodes on Amazon. I hope more of them get up there.
Well, I think I'm going to do something a little unconventional, because I think the best way to illustrate how perfectly you captured the essence of this man is to read you the letter that Fred Rogers wrote me when I was 5 years old, which I brought right here on the stage. And of course, being 5, it's a very simple letter. It's, "Dear Mr. Rogers, you do such a good job on TV. It's fun when we do the neighborhood of make-believe. I am a boy. I am 5 years old. I like to play around with my sister. I like to read books. I'm a real good reader. I love you, Mr. Rogers, your friend Matthew Fagerholm." And then I put pictures of us together and love hearts, and that's what I did at 5. So that's what I gave him. This is what he gives me. "Dear Matthew, that was a fine letter you sent me. It was good to know about you from your letter. I'm glad you enjoy our television visits and that you like the neighborhood of make-believe. Thank you for the pictures you drew of my face and your face and the hearts. The heart picture was fun to see. You have such good ideas for your drawings. Your drawings are a special gift because you made them for me. You told me in your letter that you like to read books. I'm glad to know you're a good reader. Books have always been an important part of my life, too, when I was a boy and now that I'm a grown-up. I was interested to know that you have a sister and that you like to play with her. You have a special place in your family, and so does your sister. You are growing and learning many new things every day. Now you can write a whole letter by yourself. It takes a lot of practice to write well. I'm proud of the way you're growing, and I hope you are too. Your television friend, Mr. Rogers. So that was it. It's 5 sentences, 5 paragraphs.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Let me just say, at one point, Fred got more mail than anybody in America.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he responded to every letter he got.
It's incredible.
I mean, it was a huge part of his life. I mean, 10 or 15 hours a week was doing correspondence. And to him, it wasn't a chore. That was the real work. In a way, TV was a way for him to connect with people, but it didn't matter if he was connecting to them through the television or through a letter or in real life. If a child came up to him, and any child that saw Fred Rogers would go up to him, that he acted as though he had a real relationship, because to that child and to him, that TV relationship is still a real relationship. So when a child wrote to him, that was a real relationship. And in a way, being able to minister to children one-on-one through letters was almost more satisfying to him than just the show, which is incredible when you think about it that way.
Did you learn anything about him that surprised you during this research?
I mean, many things. I mean, he was a goofball. I mean, he was, silly. He always did voices. He would call up. He had a whole series of characters, different characters for different friends. So various friends would say, Fred would call me, Phineas T, Jones would call me, or whatever these fake characters he would come up with, and they would have they'd say, I would talk to this fake character every Saturday for years without actually speaking to Fred. People told me stories too that, what was it? There was a woman who he had asked to host a television program. Oh, it was Susan Stamberg, who's in the film from NPR. And she said, I've never done television. It was a live TV show. I'm not comfortable doing it. So she said no. And she said that night she got a telephone call from Daniel Tiger saying, Susan, what are you afraid of, Susan? By the end of that call, she had agreed to do the television show. So Fred was very, it was, fun, but it was often with purpose. He was, weird in many ways,
I mean, there is that weird aspect of him too, yeah. But weird enough, to be so free, to be able to express a weirdness or an eccentricity and to realize, and he talked about struggling with feeling he was unique and he was almost not like anyone else, and was he good enough? He felt that he really, I think a lot of times felt that he wasn't good.
I mean, and I think if he hadn't been struggling with those doubts, he probably wouldn't have worked as incredibly hard as he did over decades to do that. I mean, he was driven, absolutely. But when I think about it, Fred talked like a child, and I mean that in the best possible way, which is children are honest. They'll tell you what they're feeling, what they're thinking, they'll ask what they want to know. And when we grow up, we mask our real feelings and hide our intentions because we're afraid of being hurt. And Fred had that ability to have this incredible, piercing sincerity that a child has. And when people would, as an adult, it's disarming to come across somebody who's that direct and will tell you that they're feeling and that they're scared, or just admit these things and make you admit those things of yourself. And to me, that was like his superpower. You know, it was amazing ability to have, to be truly sincere.
With this film has a few glimpses we've never had of Fred Rogers, especially the Cape Cod or the beach house or something like that. Where did that footage come from? Where did you get that?
Yeah, that was the house that's still in his family in Nantucket called the Crooked House. And I went there last summer. We were at the Nantucket Film Festival, and the family invited me out there, and I took my wife and kids, and we got to ride on the little motorboat. They still have the same motorboat, and we rode around, and like it was so great. And that had been in his family forever. It was his parents' house. And that footage came, I think they had done, so occasionally on the show, whether it was picture-picture or they would do other segments where they would do kind of field pieces where they would go and film, you know, either how crayons are being made or whatever, but sometimes it would be Mr. Rogers goes to the barber, you know, or whatever, because kids might be afraid of the barber, or the dentist. You know, in fact, as a sidebar, just because as film lovers, you guys will appreciate this, one of the first cameramen on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was George Romero. Pittsburgh's other most famous filmmaker. So, and he shot Mr. Rogers Goes to the Dentist episode. He said it was the scariest thing he ever shot. You know, so.
And one more that really stands out is the first glimpse we have of him in the movie where he's at the piano. It's black and white. It's very intimate. The camera kind of comes up to him. Where did that come from? Is that from the show?
No. It was from, there was a documentary series in 1967 called Create a Person that was on, before PBS existed, it's what became WNET, National Educational Television, and it was an East Coast thing, and they had a series, and they did an episode about him, like a half-hour episode. But somehow, he had all the outtakes. So it wasn't just the show, it was all the raw footage of them following him around in 1967. I mean, it was a godsend, you know, as a filmmaker, and just in terms of archive, yeah, there was so much great stuff. I mean, it was just, you know, like, they had so much, and it was so well organized, and there's a whole Fred Rogers Center at St. Vincent University in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, his hometown, and it's like it had been organized for 10 years, and they were waiting for us to come and make this film. Like it was like a filmmaker's dream. Just every piece of correspondence, every letter, every script note, everything was there. Nope, just the two sons.
So I got the signal that it's time to go to the audience, and someone is bringing the microphones out, please. While they're doing that, Matt, you have a question.
Okay, just one more question. Do you feel there's any essence of Fred's philosophy that guides you as a filmmaker and an artist? Because I feel like with 20 Feet from Stardom, it's the value of the people in the background, and Best of Enemies, it's the value of people who have different opinions than you. I feel like that is kind of a running constant.
Yeah, and in many ways, I feel like Fred was kind of a documentary filmmaker in his own way, in that he was an amazing listener. I mean, that was something that everybody were marked on. And that's not something you think about most TV hosts, you know, that he actually listened to people, he was present, and he was somebody who was about all of the things that essentially understanding and empathy, you know, in that same way, which I feel like that's my job, which is, you know, curiosity and empathy, you know. So I feel like I learned a lot, and this film, without a doubt, changed me and how I think about not just my filmmaking, but everything from my parenting to how I treat other people. Yeah.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful.
Down center to your left.
Center left, there.
I thought the animation was beautiful and very moving. Could you tell me something about that?
Sure. So I had this idea that I wanted the childhood scenes to be not at the beginning of the film, but narrated by him to explain those bits of his childhood that informed what he needed to do on the show and his connection to his own childhood that he then manifested on the show. And I animation just seemed like an interesting way to do it. I really wanted it to feel like old storybooks, like 1940s children's books. My wife happens to be a children's librarian, and we spent a fair amount of time digging through artwork and everything, and I found this, and actually a bunch of those old jazz album covers that were kind of airbrushed, the kind of 40s ones, and I found this great animator who was Brazilian, who had no idea who Mr. Rogers was. But he was brilliant, and I kind of gave him all the pieces. And I think my one other instruction was to watch the movie Magnificent Ambersons. And I said, if you put all that together, that's kind of what I'm looking for. And he did it, and then he came to the premiere, and he came up to me tearful afterwards, and he said, I had no idea what what this really meant. Like, I knew it was interesting, but until he saw it all together, he didn't understand. Yeah, I was very happy. About the animations? Oh, was that the question? Did I answer the wrong question? Okay.
No, I think you got it.
Yes, from the balcony in the center.
Balcony Center.
Such a wonderful, wonderful film. Thank you so much for bringing it to us. Yeah.
Thank you.
Amazing. You talked about all the choices that you had and you got so many people involved in the interview process who were part of the show. I'm curious, and maybe I missed her, why the actress who played Lady Aberlin was not included or was not part of the film since she was such an integral part of the show. Thank you.
Betty Aberlin. I talked to Betty. I've spent hours on the phone with Betty. And she lives in upstate New York. And she was really struggling with whether or not to do it. She hasn't done an interview in at least a decade. And I got close to getting her, but ultimately she just didn't feel like she wanted to go on camera. She sent me an email after she saw the film and just said, it's perfect. And that made me feel really, really good. Yeah, it's just one of those things. I mean, even in terms of kind of my process, I think there may be only 14 interviews in the film. I shot over 30, and part of my process is to kind of cast a wide net and then find the people who really kind of earn a way into the film, who have more than one thing to say, who become a character. And it's kind of amazing that virtually everybody that worked on the show is still around, too.
Microphone.
All right, we have a question over to your right, kind of midway, right here.
Right. Oh, midway.
Yes. First off, I love the film. I was an early childhood music educator, and he was a big influence on the way I deal with kids. But so I'm always looking at the musical elements, and I was curious about Johnny Costa and his ever-present genius in the show. And I know he passed in '96, but was there anything about that relationship that could have been a part of the film or that you saw?
Yeah, and I'm actually a jazz musician. I play upright bass, and and Johnny Costa, I've now gotten all of his records, and he was this amazing piano player who was kind of in the style of Art Tatum, this incredible player. And he and Fred were very, very close. Fred himself was a piano player. Fred was a composition major in college. There's a musicality to everything he does. And Johnny was like this salty jazz musician with, everybody kept saying they were the most unlikely pair because Johnny was had a filthy mouth, told dirty jokes, whatever, but, Fred liked that. And Johnny would play, so when they recorded the show, Johnny would be there with the piano, improvising live throughout the entire show, which is so unusual. So if there was a moment, Johnny would just be constantly just filling it in, and occasionally he would go back and overdub drums and bass, but he would always be playing live, and the sound of the trolley was the Celeste that Johnny played, and I did have more about that in earlier cuts, and it's just one of those painful things that didn't fit into this. I would love somebody to do the Johnny Costa story, and there are other, just in the raw material, what Fred had, there's a lot of footage of them and the band, and there's kind of a shot you see at the very beginning where you see him transitioning from the band live in the studio, walking over to the stage. So yeah, I'd love more Johnny Costa in the world.
There's so much about his show, the elements of putting together a television show, that today I don't know if he would have had the kind of freedom to do a lot of the things that he did. And he actually, everything he did sort of went against producing like a really slick children's television show.
And he also, like that moment where he walks from the musicians over to the stage, that he was constantly interested in showing the mechanics of making the show and not ever pretending that it was fake, but kind of, and there were times where they did episodes about behind the scenes on the show, and he wanted to do an episode where Big Bird was going to come visit, but he said he would only do it on the condition that Big Bird took his costume off. He was not, because Fred always felt it was important to level with children about what is real. In fact, the only hate mail Fred ever got.
Oh, I was going to say Margaret Hamilton, Wizard of Oz. She comes in, takes
exactly
the makeup
Wicked
off.
Witch,
the Wicked Witch,
the Wicked Witch of the East.
West in the Wizard of Oz. Yeah, she came in
because she's a character who's famously haunted a lot of children with the flying monkeys and everything, and he had her come on the show with her costume and take it off. But I will say the most hate mail, and it wasn't really hate mail, but the most complaints Fred ever got was he did an episode in the early 80s where he explained to children that Santa Claus wasn't real.
Oh. That naughty Mr. Rogers.
Virginia,
microphone.
He's in our hearts.
Center all the way back.
Center back.
Down the aisle, to your left.
Over here.
Oh, there.
So I just wanted to say my wife and I love the movie. We love Fred Rogers. I hate to bring up hate, but we saw Fred Phelps and the Westboro Baptist Church when Fred passed, 4 or 5 years ago, stood outside of his procession and mocked this guy. And I was livid then, and as much as I wanted to be tearful and crying, I was livid to the end of this movie because of that in the film. And I guess what I was thinking of, that's fine that was in there. I just wonder, how do you think Fred Rogers would deal with somebody like that, like the Westboro Baptist Church pulling that?
It's, somebody, I think it was after the Iranian hostage crisis, somebody did an interview with Fred, and somebody said something to the effect of, what do you make of this evil act? And Fred said, I don't do good and evil. That's not helpful. It's not helpful to understanding. We're never going to fix anything if we label things good and evil. I think what Fred would say is, I wonder what happened to that person in their life to make them do that. What happened to them in their childhood? How were they treated? I think it was always from a place of understanding. And that is hard to do. A lot of us get upset about things. To me, I will just say, not to get political, but mildly political, that to me, maybe my proudest day with this film, where I felt like I did what I wanted to do, was the day of the Brett Kavanaugh vote in the Senate, that Lisa Murkowski, the one GOP senator who did not vote for Brett Kavanaugh, went home after the vote and tweeted, "I had to come home and watch the Mr. Rogers documentary." And I felt like that was the message I wanted to send.
Does that say one more?
We got the last question over here, right in the center.
Center.
Yes, my name is Marcia Bradford, and this is the second time I've seen this show and cried all the way through it. I think it's an extraordinary documentary, and I want to thank you so much and all the folks that worked with you for making it. I've worked with families as an attorney, a mediator, and a therapist, and watching it the second time I have this question, I feel like it's maybe a very personal question. I might not ask it if Fred were still alive, but I'm wondering about his own sons, and I'm wondering, while making this film, whether you were able to glean whether or not they felt the closeness to their father. Well, what were their feelings about their father? Did he ever struggle as a dad? Did his kids, after that minute,
Sure.
They did not say whom they were thinking about. So that is my question.
I am so glad you asked that question because I was wondering about that thing and I never got a chance to ask you and the differences between the sons and what do they do and, you know, one, I don't know, but I think it's a good question.
I mean, so Fred was, first of all, the sons loved their father. And Fred went out of his way to be home for dinner every night whenever he could. I mean, they tried to have a normal relationship. When they became teenagers in the 1970s, Fred was much better at talking to young kids than he was, you know, rock and roll teenagers in the 70s. And he would ask his sons to try and connect to them. What do you like? You know, give me music. One of his sons, John, said that he would give his dad tapes of music. He'd give him Frank Zappa, Captain Beefheart, things he was listening to. And he said the music my dad liked the most was Bob Marley. And if you think about it, the message of those songs is very much one love. He said, of course, I didn't give him the ganja songs. But the hard part was that their dad wasn't theirs. I mean, imagine any time you're in public with your father your entire life, any child that saw him felt like he was their other dad too. I mean, I think it was a really difficult situation for them to have to kind of share their father and to carry the weight of being Mr. Rogers' sons. And I know, for instance, when we went to interview John, the one with the beard and the pirate's hat, our sound man in Pittsburgh said, "Oh, I've known John for a long time because we hang out at the same, you know, whatever places." And he said, I knew John for 10 years before I knew his dad was Mr. Rogers. That it was one of those things that I think they, you know, there was a tremendous amount of kind of love, but also hurt at the situation, you know, and I don't know how it could have been different, you know. I think it was just one of those situations that was really tough. But I will say, when I screened this film for Joanne, after we were done, I flew to Pittsburgh and I screened it for her, which was one of the most nerve-wracking things one could ever do, and I made the tragic mistake of sitting in front of her, so I couldn't watch her while she was watching. And after it was over, I turned around and she said two things. She said, "Fred would have loved this film." And I smiled, and she said, the other thing she said was, "This film is going to be so good for the boys." And this is the first time either of them has ever done an interview in their life. So for them, it was a chance to kind of reclaim their dad in a way. And both of them have been so great throughout this whole year supporting the film and coming and speaking at screenings, and I think it has been good for them.
Thank you. Thank you, Morgan Neville.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.